If you were with us the last time, you heard me introduce you to the concept of popular politics in American life, and I introduced you to not only the Democratic Party, but also a co-founder of the party, a guy named Andrew Jackson. And I told you that he really represented this evolution in American politics in terms of a populist or a man of the people. Today, what I want to talk about would be the Jacksonian presidency and how that is going to affect American life all across the board, for so to speak. I want to begin by explaining that Jackson promised to be a president for all the people. This was part of his appeal to the common masses, the idea that he would not just simply take orders from the economically well-to-do or the politically powerful, but he would represent the common man, people like Sam Patch, for instance. In doing that, he vowed to limit the scope, power, and size of the federal government. And in ways, I think he was successful. I do think that you can see government essentially having a more limited approach to it during Jackson's time in the presidency, depending on exactly who you're talking about. In ways, he was not exactly a man of his word. Jackson, as you're going to find out, is going to establish the executive branch of government, the presidential branch of government, as the most important, most powerful branch of the federal system. So it's kind of strange in the sense that at the same time that he's shrinking the size of government, he's making the office of the presidency a lot more powerful. Again, you'll see what I mean once we get into this whole issue of Jackson butting heads with Congress in the 1830s, and especially Johnson ignoring a ruling that came out of the Supreme Court around about the same time. But for right now, I want to push this envelope and talk to you a little bit about what's going on in South Carolina, even in the aftermath of Jackson's election. I kind of floated this idea the last time we met that the tariff of 1828 was not exactly appreciated in South Carolina. As a matter of fact, it was referred to as the tariff of abomination in South Carolina. Um, to that end, what South Carolina said in 1832 is we're just simply not going to collect the tax on it. It's not going to happen. You didn't ask us how we felt about it. We really didn't have any opportunity to weigh in. And most importantly of all, you're taking money out of our state. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that you have a right to tax South Carolina for the benefit of Ohio or from the benefit of Massachusetts. That's unfair, it's unconstitutional, and you don't have the power to do it. So we're issuing something called the Ordinance of Nullification. Essentially, what they were saying is that tariff of 1828 was null and void within the boundaries of South Carolina. We're not going to collect your tax. We're simply going to ignore the law. Um, Jackson's a lot of things. If you followed me the last time we met, you know that I said he would rattle when he would walk, and he was a dueler, and all of these things. But the other thing that he was a constitutional purist. I don't think that Andrew Jackson had a lot of love lost between New England industrialists and the idea of taxing things like consumer items, textiles. What I'm getting at here is in spirit, I think that Andrew Jackson kind of agreed with what South Carolina had to say. But what I'm also saying is he was a purist in the sense that a sitting U.S. Congress had passed that law fair and square. And to not, as a fully functioning state within the Union, as a state that had ratified the U.S. Constitution, the playing rules, as such, to not obey those laws amounted to treason. Jackson wanted to march down to South Carolina and start hanging people, start executing them as traitors. Fortunately, we've got Henry Clay. He's the architect of compromise, and believe me, we certainly need compromise at this particular moment. On the one hand, considering John C. Calhoun at one point was Andrew Jackson's vice president. We can't have the president executing the vice president simply for ideological differences. So along comes Henry Clay, and what he does is he compromises the way out of it. On the one hand, in 1833, what you get is a law that comes out of Congress that comes to be known as the Force Bill. And the Force Bill is very easy to understand and very easy to remember if you just think of the word force. What the Force Bill essentially said was it was illegal to not comply with federal law. And if you did not comply, as South Carolina was not complying, the federal government could force you through the use of military force. So you either rescind your ordinance of nullification, or the federal government will force you to do so. We will force you into compliance. Now, to sweeten the deal from South Carolina's perspective, what Henry Clay is able to do is understand that really this is about money. This is about dollars and cents. It's not about the principle so much. And so what he introduces alongside the Force Bill is a reduction of the tariff. In other words, year one, and I'm just using random numbers as examples, but year one, the tariff is going to be 5%. Year two, it'll be 2.5%. Year three, it'll be 1.5%. Year four, it'll be 0.5%. And by the time that year five rolls around, you'll barely even know that you're paying a tax on textiles. Once they began to really reduce the rate of the tax, people began to back away. And everybody walked away happy. This really was a great compromise in the sense that South Carolina was happy because this was about money at the end of the day. Andrew Jackson was happy because South Carolina rescinded its ordinance of nullification and began to comply with the law. Everybody was happy, and Henry Clay is going to save the day, and that's why we don't have a civil war in the 1830s. That's very important considering by the 1830s, we're probably not strong enough of a nation to really survive a traumatic event like the Civil War. Not the last time that Jackson was going to butt heads when it comes to the role of the federal government. Um, it's no secret that Henry Clay desperately wanted to be president. Had a very different vision for America. Certainly, it was more different than that of Andrew Jackson. And so that being the case, what Clay is going to do is he's going to try to set a trap for Andrew Jackson. Henry Clay understands really two things. Number one, he understands that that bank that Alexander Hamilton and George Washington had established very early on in American history, the Bank of North America, it had a shelf life. I mentioned this at the time that it would only be good for a specified amount of years, and then whoever was in the White House years later would have to recharter it, would have to, give it another however many years of life. He also understands that Andrew Jackson hates banks. He absolutely hates them. He hates the very concept of banking. I'm sure you can kind of see where this one is headed. Henry Clay understands that while Andrew Jackson and most Americans, for that matter, hate the banks and hate bankers, banks are critically important to the economy, to any economy. And so what he begins to do is he puts together a plan to recharter the bank, and knowing that Andrew Jackson is most likely going to veto it. He is not going to sign a law that gives the bank new life. Maybe the only thing that Andrew Jackson hated more than banks was Henry Clay. Hated Henry Clay. So if he sees that this is a bill to recharter the bank, that's going to make him mad. And what's going to make him even madder is the fact that this came from the desk of Henry Clay. So there's like a 99.99% chance that Jackson completely smacks this down. And he did. Henry Clay is operating on the idea that when Jackson takes down the bank right before the election of 1832, he's going to take down the American economy with it. Now, if you watch the news or you read the newspapers, you're going to understand that for good, better, or worse, the American voters blame the president for the economy. On the flip side of that coin, the president gets way too much credit when the economy is good. There's a lot of factors that go into this, but Henry Clay understands this idea that when the bank goes down, it's probably going to crush the rest of the American economy, and voters are going to take out their frustrations on Andrew Jackson. Most importantly of all, Henry Clay is going to be able to say, I gave you the tools. I gave you the law that would have helped you save our economy. And you were too stupid. You were too short sighted to see it. You were more interested in knocking down the bank than you were thinking long term about the American economy. So you don't have any business being reelected. Henry Clay can taste the presidency. He can hear them chanting his name. Everything goes according to plan with two very, very important exceptions. One, although Jackson does veto the bank, Henry Clay had not anticipated him giving a speech, thereby explaining why he was actually vetoing it. In this speech, Andrew Jackson, of course, I'm paraphrasing him, but Andrew Jackson says, listen, I'm not for Wall Street. I'm not for banks or bankers. I am for middle America. I'm for Main Street. And that's part of the reason that I'm vetoing the bank. But the other big reason is the main shareholder, the country that owns the most amount of shares in the Bank of North America, this corporation, they're not even American. They're British. And why would I vote? Why would I sign off on an institution that's not even owned by Americans? It's a populist message. And Henry Clay just straight up had never really anticipated the possibility of Andrew Jackson, a populist if there ever was one, delivering a populist explanation for why he was doing what he was doing. The other thing that Henry Clay maybe overestimated was how quickly taking down the bank would affect the American economy. Sometimes when a law is put into place as far as the economy is concerned, or a law is repealed, it's not instantaneous. I like to think of this as similar to trying to steer the Titanic. You can steer all you want to, but that thing is not going to turn on a dime. And sometimes in the economy, it takes years, sometimes even decades, for results or negative results to start showing up in the lives of everyday American people. Here's the long and short of it. It took longer than Henry Clay had anticipated. Jackson goes ahead and vetoes the bank. They're not chanting Henry Clay's name. As a matter of fact, what they're chanting is 4 more years, 4 more years. And this carries him to reelection in 1832. It's in 1837 that the economy crashes, and Andrew Jackson is not in the White House when it crashes. It's the guy that comes after Andrew Jackson, even though essentially it was his fault for taking down the bank, which dried up credit all throughout the country. It was really him that destroyed the economy, but certainly he's not going to get blamed for it. And so those were the two big follies that Henry Clay just didn't see. And you can understand that because they were big, complex things, it would have been very difficult for him to see them in the first place. But I digress. What I want to do now is talk a little bit about Andrew Jackson's policy with respect to Native Americans. Two things to that end. Keep in mind that Andrew Jackson really became a household name by fighting Native Americans. It was that battle at Horseshoe Bend, his victory there at Horseshoe Bend over the Creek Indians, that essentially not only made him into the military name that we generally remember him as, but also gave us the state that we call Arkansas. Okay, that was part of the provisions of the Native American surrender. My point is, nowhere anywhere was there a bigger Indian fighter than Andrew Jackson, and certainly he had that reputation going into the White House. The other thing that I want you to understand here, as racist and as just terrible as this might sound, there really wasn't too many other ways to demonstrate how pro middle class you were than removing Native Americans from their ancestral homelands to make it open to white settlement. mean, think about it. The more people you remove from places like Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, the more farmland you can open up to working class whites that don't have access to it right now, that desperately want it, that desperately need it. That really is going to portray you as a populist, a guy that understands that these working men and women, they need access to land. Of course, it doesn't take the Native American perspective into account, and that's what I want to talk about now. Um, in 1830, Congress issues a law called the Indian Removal Act. And this law does exactly what it sounds like it does. It pretty much notifies Native Americans, really everywhere in the United States or parts that the US government controls, that they would essentially be relocated to Indian reservations. They would be shoved into parts of North America that, at least for the moment, the government felt that it didn't want, didn't care about. First Kansas and then eventually Oklahoma. Um, there was plenty of dissent to go around, and I mean that from the Native American perspective. One quick example. Chief Blackhawk was a military official of the Fox and Sauk people in what is today northern and western Illinois. And what Blackhawk vowed to do was resist. He said that he was not going to comply with the law, and neither would his people, and they planned on remaining on their ancestral homelands. What Andrew Jackson's going to do is he's going to mobilize the U.S. military. He is going to push Blackhawk and his warriors out of the state of Illinois into what was at the time the Wisconsin Territory. And what comes to be known as the Bad Axe Massacre, Jackson's forces are going to massacre 800 of Blackhawk's warriors, even though Blackhawk had more or less admitted defeat and pretty much had surrendered at that point. Now, why do I tell you this? The reason I tell you this is that Jackson, in this case of Blackhawk and the Bad Axe Massacre, was demonstrating I am more than happy to use military force when it comes to clearing the land of Native Americans. In other words, I will use military force to execute the Indian Removal Act. Enter into our conversation the Cherokee. Unlike the Fox, unlike the Seminoles in Florida, who fought the government sometimes into the very last man, the Cherokee did not fight on the battlefield, they fought in the courtroom, and through 1832, they were doing a really good job. What I mean by that is the Cherokee had essentially organized themselves as a separate nation. And when the Indian Removal Act came out, they sued the federal government in federal court by proclaiming that they were a separate independent nation and therefore they were not subject to any American laws. Similar to the way that France was its own country and naturally what was being passed in the United States was certainly not relevant to what was going on in Paris. The Cherokee were not going to comply with the Indian Removal Act. In 1832, this is going to go all the way to the Supreme Court in a very famous case entitled Worcester versus Georgia. And in that case, the Supreme Court is actually going to find in favor of the Cherokee. In other words, the court agreed they are a nation within another nation, and therefore they don't have to comply with your laws. Here's the thing. Supreme Court rulings, um, legal renderings whatsoever. All they are pieces of paper. That's all they are, right? And unless you're prepared to enforce what it says on that piece of paper, then what good is that piece of paper? What good is the law? Quick modern day example, more modern day example. In 1954, the Supreme Court says that school segregation is unconstitutional. It's not as if everybody just went ahead and integrated right thereafter. It took a president, a guy named Dwight Eisenhower, to actually mobilize federal troops to escort African Americans, students, into Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Without Dwight Eisenhower mobilizing those troops, what good was the Brown decision? My point is, this decision that says essentially that the Cherokee could hold on to their homelands, it's only as relevant, it's only as meaningful as Andrew Jackson is willing to enforce it. And let's be honest, there's really nothing that indicates that he's even remotely interested in enforcing it. And the long and short of it is, Jackson and the state of Georgia pretty much ignored the ruling. They ignored the Supreme Court, right? The Supreme Court is not the muscle. Andrew Jackson's the muscle. Just ask Blackhawk when it comes to that. Now, where I'm going with all of this is a process known as the Trail of Tears. What Jackson's going to do is he's going to mobilize the military, but not to defend the Cherokee, but to actually round them up, forcibly march them from their native Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, all the way across the Appalachian Mountains, halfway across the continent, into what at the time was what was considered to be permanent Indian country. You call it Kansas. But for right now, this is a process. This Indian removal is known as the Trail of Tears. The records are a little bit sketchy, but we believe upwards of 4,000 Cherokee died along the trail. Keep in mind, this is not a walk in the woods here. This is a forced migration, and old people died, sick people died, people that could not keep up, they died. In a way, certainly the Cherokee would say it as such. This was a Holocaust, that they were essentially led to their death. And it's not a very comfortable conversation in American history, but it's one that needs to be had, considering in a lot of ways that land in the East was opened up more or less through the process of conquest, colonization. In any case, the Trail of Tears is also a good example of what we had described as a white man's government. This is a time period where it's becoming more and more small d democratic for white men and less democratic for everybody else. Certainly, the Cherokee would qualify as everybody else, considering they're having their ancestral homelands simply, jerked out right underneath their feet. Where I'm going with all of this is the impact of the Jacksonian presidency. And as I said before, for all of his talk about limiting government and states' rights and things of that variety, Andrew Jackson actually was making the presidency a lot more powerful. He's going to leave the presidency a lot more powerful than he found it. On the one hand, pretty much shutting down what was going on with Henry Clay and the bank. Good example as to what I mean when it comes to his relationship with Congress. And on the other hand, simply ignoring the Supreme Court decision with respect to the Cherokee. In these ways, and others, but in these ways, what's going to happen is that the presidency is going to become much more similar to how you and I would think about this in our more modern times. A lot of Americans, historians, believe that this is one of the reasons that Jackson's presidency is one of the more important presidencies in American history. Other historians believe that Jackson brought government nearer to the people. As I said before, we're not talking about somebody that was born into his position, was born into wealth or prestige. This was a guy that was kind of up from the commons, up from nothing. And in that way, even though this seems twisted and warped, and it is, in ways, what this is ultimately going to do is it is going to give a much more popular side of American politics. Opening up Cherokee lands, for example, really came across as pro middle class. Now, what I want to leave you with is certainly Jackson was not without his critics. But the fact of the matter is, Jackson and the Democrats have figured out a very effective way to win elections, to get to 51%. So if you want to remain relevant, and you're not the biggest fan of Andrew Jackson, then you're going to have to find a way to neutralize or at least address the whole issue of popular politics. You'll see what I mean the next time when we go through the building of the Whig Party. For right now, that's all I've got.